my secret. Just do something that ain't nobody ever done before, but make it sound like something that's always been there forever.
Hello, welcome to This Filipino American Life, a podcast that explores the nuanced experiences of Filipinos in the United States at Iba Pa. This is producer Mike.
Woohoo! Wow, that is in a reverse order.
I know, it's weird.
And with me are my fellow co-hosts.
Joe Bernardo.
Ryan Carpio.
Elaine DeLawis.
Yeah, usually I come after all of that, right? Yeah, it totally throws it off a little
There's
bit.
enough when you start. We don't know how to do this.
So, we haven't been in the studio for a little while. Glad to be back in the studio.
know.
So
It's been a long time.
kind of dusting off the cobwebs, a little bit of the studio rust. So, who is our TFAL of the episode, Elaine?
The TFAL of the episode is Ruel Gaviola.
Ruel!
And
Thank you.
I don't have to ask, do you know him? Because we do know
Yes.
him.
UCSB alum.
And thank you for all your support, because you always say hi whenever we're in the same space, and we are excited to see you.
And he's the expert in games. Yes.
We'll have him on one day. I
One
want
of
to
these
talk to
days,
him
yeah,
about
yeah.
like gaming.
If you love board games, any kind of board games,
Yeah.
he's like the expert on it.
It's so cool. So
like
thank
Monopoly?
No, these are way more complicated games. Shout out to Dylan Delvo, who got me into those complicated games in the first place.
What
What?
game?
Well, not really got me into it.
Mind
you.
games?
Like Risk?
The sex game.
Oh my God.
No.
Wow.
Delete.
No. He got these are like very super duper complicated like
Like
board
Settlers
games.
of Catan?
Something like yeah.
I like that game.
I don't know what that is, but
I play that
yeah.
a lot.
Oh, okay.
Well, not a lot, but I'd like to play it.
Or the Cones of Dunshire.
Oh, what?
I don't know what that is, but okay.
Oh, that's a reference to Parks and Rec.
Yeah, not there yet.
Oh, you're not there yet. I got Ryan into
Spoiler
Yeah.
alert.
it. Sorry. We also have a voicemail. I should play.
Voicemail.
Yes. Here it is.
Happy New Year, TFAL. Happy New Year, TFAL. Happy New Year, TFAL.
Happy New Year, TFAL.
Happy New Year, TFAL.
Happy New Year. It's January. It's at the end of January, but that is Happy New Year in the theme of Ang Pasko ay Sumapit,
Yeah.
which is Christmas is coming.
It's also Lunar New Year, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
that's right.
so it's
Lunar New Year.
apropos.
Yes.
It's apropos.
For all the Chinoys out there.
Who was the one singing that?
I don't know. Some random fan.
Really?
Yeah, random
Oh,
fan.
it's Random Fan.
Oh, man.
Nice.
Well, thank you, Random Fan,
Fan.
for your holiday New Year's
Greeting.
greeting.
Thank you, Random Fan. No person we don't know.
All right. What are we talking about today, Producer Mike?
We are talking about homelessness.
What?
That's deep.
Yeah, and it's I mean it's a particularly personal topic for me just because I happen to work in the field of homelessness for 10 years now, actually.
10 years. Wow.
Yeah,
It's been that
I
long.
mean straight out of like grad school and into kind of just actually like a world that I didn't really know much about. Because before all of that, I was working in the Filipino community. I still kind of do, but I kind of just came in cold and kind of just learned it all as I went along. But also because, like, I mean, homelessness is not something that like came up in a lot of conversations, growing up. Honestly, I mean, I don't know if that was like a topic of conversation at all for your families.
Nope.
Nope.
It's one of those things where if my parents saw a homeless person, they'll probably either give them food or, like, if they're like on the freeway on ramp, they'll give them either food or like $1 or something.
Mm-hmm.
I'm ashamed to say this, but my mom would like tell me, Joseph, make sure your doors is locked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, if they pass by.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sad reality. But yeah, that's kind of like my parents' attitude. It's like maybe a little bit donation here, but still keeping their guard
Right.
because there's a certain stigma about homelessness.
I mean, yeah, I mean, the extent for me was like, yeah, my dad giving people food or cash,
Right.
you know, when they see him on like the side of the road or the freeway. But I don't think we talked about the whys or the hows or any more involvement in that. How about for you guys?
Nah, even for me, I don't even think that word was ever used. Like homeless person or a person experiencing homelessness. You know, growing up, I hate to say it too, like bringing up my parents, but you know, I was like, oh, that bum, right? It's like always bum, that bum, that bum over there, the bum in the corner, kind of thing. So it was never really a topic that was ever discussed in our family. Yeah, and I don't know if it's I'm trying to think if whether or not we talk about it now, but it's definitely more visible now, especially here in Los Angeles, right? We've seen some dramatic changes. I've seen dramatic changes in the city. I imagine that it's happening all across the country too, but especially here in LA, it's almost unavoidable talking about it. But personally speaking, I don't think we talk about it enough. Yeah.
Elaine?
Yeah, it's same. Like my parents didn't really talk about it, or they would maybe give $1. My mom wouldn't say anything, but she would like always lock the door.
Yeah.
And then before my parents, like townhouse complex had a gate. If my dad ever saw someone like go in to like do the trash cans to like get the recycling, my dad would just give like whatever recycling we would have in the garage to that person. And like, I don't know if that person was homeless. They could have just been like just looking for cans, but my dad would just give them that stuff so that they could, you know, like they needed it more than like me, because the recycling always ended up getting in my pocket when we would trade it in.
Yeah.
That's here in America, but do you have experiences of your parents treating homeless in the Philippines? Or like what are the attitudes toward homelessness in the Philippines?
So my dad grew up really poor, like slums. I don't know necessarily, you know, now that I think about it, I don't know necessarily if there is such a classification of people who are experiencing homelessness in the Philippines.
What about squatters and stuff?
That's what I'm saying. Like squatters squat in a roof, right? There's definitely squatters, but there's not. I imagine it to be different, right? I imagine the idea of the classification of like a homeless person, because a squatter to me in the Philippines is very different. They squat in like a building, right? Or in I don't know. I don't know why I think about it very, very differently. But I don't know what their experiences were like per se. I only know that my dad grew up pretty much in the slums in Manila, in a poor neighborhood. It doesn't mean that they didn't have community. It just meant that everybody was just kind of like in a tight space, tight living quarters, making ends meet.
I think like housing needs are met in different ways in different cultures and countries, right? I mean, you know, in a lot of, you know, nations where there is a large percentage of people who are like impoverished, you know, in poverty, you know, there are those, you know, what people will call like slums or what people call like kind of like shanty towns or whatever word people use, that in some way or another is like kind of informally kind of accepted as like a thing. But would they consider themselves, or people outside of that consider them homeless because they have a place to go to? Technically, they're off the grid. They don't, you know. And so I think it's a different kind of perception of what it means to like not have like say like a home that you're renting or paying for in some way. You know, and maybe there's like a little bit of that cultural difference when people come here.
Right, and I think even here, right? I think part of this apprehension to talk about it, or even in like the Filipino American experience of being immigrants here, it's such a different perception of folks who are not living under a roof, who might be now you can see tents, right? But back then there was like, oh, there's people living under a bridge or something like that. Like the you know, people who are experiencing homelessness. There's almost this stigma amongst like Filipino Americans who look at that as a choice. You know, you choosing to live that way. and it may not be so, and there's just myths surrounding that, the idea that it is a choice by some folks. Definitely for sure that there are some studies that are done that are like the economy has made it so impossible to live and pay rent.
Yeah.
But yeah, I that's what I was trying to get at, Joe. I think there's different needs and kind of basic needs that are met through like a house, or I think tent cities are probably like the most similar I could see in terms of like the Filipinos who are squatting or having roofs over their heads, not necessarily meeting their basic needs, just a roof, right? Or squatting under a roof. So, but even then, I don't even think my parents necessarily talked about it that much with me.
Yeah, my dad, I mean, the way he describes the way that he grew up, I mean, it sounds like, I mean, my definitely his family was not like well off.
Right.
I mean, he kind of, made ends meet with the family by like selling pandesal or something on this, like going door to door on the streets or whatever. And so there was like an informal economy also for them to kind of like find a way to kind of get by day to day, which I don't know. I mean, to varying degrees, like in America or in Los Angeles in particular, it can be difficult to try to do in a sustainable way, especially when you consider the cost of living out here. It's not like, people find ways to kind of cope with their economic situations in different ways. And, society either like allows or like looks down on kind of those different approaches. And I think the way that we perceive what a homeless person is here in America is shaped by kind of like, there is this line of like, you're in the mainstream and you're not in the mainstream. And you're in an actual house versus something that we don't consider housing, or is not actually meant to be housing. You're just kind of sleeping where you're able to sleep. Right. And the levels of like, safety and community that kind of come with that will differ. Yeah. But yeah, I think maybe it's uniquely American in some ways, the way that it's kind of like framed and addressed and even created. Right. I mean, there's a lot of strong arguments for the fact that like homelessness as it exists now, as we understand it, really kind of came up like maybe in the 80s. I mean, there was like homelessness before that, but I mean, changes in the way that we provide services, supports, social security, the economy, cost of living, everything else, like really started to really shift under Reagan, giving us kind of the version of houselessness, homelessness that we are dealing with now. Especially in a city like LA, which is definitely considered one of the centers of homelessness in the country.
Do you think that has anything to do with being the kind of like the center, like our geography, close to the water, weather, is resources, is that something, or is it just, I'm curious to know, like, it was just the population of like being in Los Angeles. I'm always curious about whether or not like.
No, I mean, a lot of people have theories about kind of like why that is. And I mean, it has probably more to do with kind of like the characteristics of Los Angeles itself than it has to do with like, people thinking that they can come to LA. I mean, there's obviously an element of folks who come to LA because they feel like, maybe they can make it here, in terms of like finding a job. I mean, there's the Hollywood and kind of that industry, and there's kind of like that kind of, and that's real for some folks. But I mean, by and large, like, when you think about the folks who experience homelessness in this community, most of them are from this community, are dealing with kind of like the economic inequities of this community. I mean, you also think about like the legacies of redlining and just like the unavailability of housing to certain, groups of folks over the generations, and the legacy of that, still being felt today. I remember when we went to Seattle like last year, right? And there was a redlining exhibit at the Wing Luke Museum talking about how like Filipinos weren't allowed to live in certain places. So they were kind of pushed to the margins in different ways. And they found ways to kind of establish the community. But imagine like, a place like LA where like the legacies also, I mean, it's the same thing in Seattle, but the legacies of that still kind of exist, and people are kind of given less resources and less access to resources just because of their color, their culture, etc. So, I think it's just maybe a factor of like how big LA is and how many people there are, and the history of the city has of just making it hard for folks to really, in an equitable way, survive.
Right. Have you seen Filipino homelessness here in America?
Personally, no, I haven't really kind of like seen it. Yeah, I haven't. I've heard stories, of course, but I really haven't seen it firsthand. Yeah.
I can't. I don't. If I can't recall it, I'm gonna have to say no. Then.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like around Filipino town, I'll see people who just on appearances I think are Filipino and are either living in poverty or homeless.
Yeah.
But I can't say for sure. I mean, the numbers don't bear themselves out. At least when you look at the homeless count numbers, which just happened last week. And also, but there isn't a category for like Filipinos within that, right? Like, and the number of Asian Americans homeless, I think the last count was like somewhere like 200-300 or something,
Which is relatively low compared to
it's like underrepresented. I mean, the thing that's coming up later this year is like the census, right? And like in just any like attempt or opportunity to kind of identify kind of the size and the need of like the Asian American population is just challenge in general,
right?
Just because of like, we're underrepresented in kind of a lot of like those kind of statistical kind of analyses, right? And so they're probably out there, but we just don't see them in the numbers. That doesn't mean they don't exist,
right?
So, I mean, there was a couple articles, right, like recently talking about homeless Filipinos.
Yeah, there's like I remember there's one in Winnipeg. It's Canada. It's different. But I remember there was 3 in historic Filipino town that I remember, or in and around that area. There's one who used to panhandle for a Bahay Kubo. I remember the guy, and then and then there was this lady who, under like a bridge around there, and then I remember this older guy who was in front of Dollar Hits, and he would always kind of whatchamacallit, like direct parking.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no.
I don't know him, but I mean I know you're.
He would direct parking, and then after he would ask for like a tip after, like that's what they do in the Philippines.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's a very Filipino thing.
Yeah,
a lot of kids do that.
Yeah. And I know there was like a homeless person who used to like stay at PWC kind of before they turned their place into affordable housing.
Yeah.
So it's out there. I think I mentioned it when we interview Andrew that there's like a couple people who I know who are not car homeless, but who live in their cars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of good documentary done by TFC called Box City. It's about homeless group of homeless people in San Francisco.
Oh, cool.
And then just randomly when I was doing research, I saw this one. There's this kind of weird cop show. Remember that show Cops?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's a Filipino version, right? And then in the Philippines, and then but they did like a few episodes in America, mainly around Daly City.
Okay.
Right. And then in one of the episodes, or one of the segments, they basically found the Daly City Police Department. Like one of them was a Filipino officer. They found a Filipino homeless person, like sleeping in front of like a laundromat. And they just totally criminalized them.
Oh, man.
Yeah, totally got them up, frisked them, like, went through the belongings and stuff like that. Like, told them to, like, put your hands behind your back. And then while they checked their stuff, and then just shooed them away.
Yeah.
It was just horrible to see that.
Yeah, when you think about, like, the barriers that homeless people experience, I mean, the second they hit the streets, like they're othered, right?
Right.
They might have been from the community at some point or another, but like the second they're no longer in a place that they rent or own, they're seen as like no longer stakeholders somehow.
Yeah.
And then all of their rights seem to magically disappear.
Right.
And now imagine if you're like Filipino, right? And like, whatever circumstances and it caused you to become homeless. I mean, do you engage with like people in the same way? Like even when people that I know were losing their homes, I mean, my family included, but like, the way they interacted with the folks that were in their immediate circle and their families, like, was completely different. Like, they almost kind of like disappeared and didn't want to talk to anybody about their situation.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, like, our safety net is that group. And so if that safety net isn't there, I mean, are you going to go and look for services? No, you're just going to hide away somehow and try to figure your stuff out. And then, if you become homeless, I mean, that's just like a double kind of barrier to you actually just being able to kind of get the help that might exist out there.
Yeah. What do you guys think about like rethinking about like what our ideas of homelessness are, right? Like, for example, just kind of the criminalization of homelessness. I don't even know what the crime is. Like, I don't even know what advantage it is to stop and frisk someone. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
it feels so backwards. I mean, I almost get it in a. I actually don't. I actually don't anymore get it. But you know, like,
Always criminalizing poor people.
right. Like,
Yeah.
how I don't. You know, I guess I'm getting to the point of like, how is that helping them?
Yeah. And it's
Right?
not. I mean,
And it's not.
The answer is that it's not. And I mean, I
Yeah.
think that's just our knee-jerk reaction as a society to deal with things that are outside of the quote-unquote norm by shooing it away, as we were saying earlier. And one of the mechanisms that exists in our society is, you know, law enforcement, right?
Right.
But I think, you know, if you talk to anyone in homeless services, and I'm sure we'll get into this in the conversation with Andrew, is that, you know, we need to be the front line of like not doing that to people experiencing homelessness, right? Like to kind of recognize that they have humanity, that they are people that have needs and that are in a crisis situation. I mean, the thing that we like to say about homelessness in general is that like, because of our economic situation, the cost of housing, and everything else, like all of us are maybe like one crisis away from becoming homeless too, you know? And if you imagine that you could be that person on the street, then maybe that'll help you kind of empathize with the fact that like, this person just experienced and is currently still experiencing a crisis. You know, do you arrest them for the crisis, or do you help them deal with the crisis and help them kind of come back, you know, into a more healthy situation for themselves? And, you know, I mean, that's really the only way to really solve homelessness, is really thinking about how do we stop, you know, criminalization of people of color in general, and criminalization of poverty, and now criminalization of people who don't have a home, only serves to help us, like, you know, fill the jails and doesn't actually solve the problem itself. It just kind of continues to grow it and almost make it a core component of our, you know, our society, our economy, and politics. So.
Imagine if we just use all the resources we have for like jailing, like randomness of to actually providing services for homeless.
I mean, it's
Right?
it's measurably cheaper to help someone get back into housing than to criminalize them. Like the costs are magnitudes different. Like imagine like someone going to emergency room, going into jail, all the costs of that versus just helping somebody out with their rent.
Yeah.
It's significantly like cheaper to just get people the help they need as opposed to punishing them for needing help.
Yeah.
It was horrible. I was watching this news segment on YouTube, and it was basically this this homeless family who's living in their car, and it was the husband who has 2 jobs, the wife who's taking care of their 4 kids, and they live in the car. And then the comments were just horrible.
Yeah.
The comments were like, "Well, nobody told you to have 4 kids."
Oh God.
Oh.
Oh man.
Yeah, you know, and I mean, there's like a whole like, you know, shaming of like poverty, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Sure.
you know, why does he have a cell phone then, or something like that? Like,
Yeah.
what is that about?
That's
Like,
a nice car.
yeah, you know, and I think it just comes down to, and this is maybe the conversation we have to have with our own, you know, communities and families, is like, you know, what about when Uncle blah 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 was like, you know, sleeping on the couch?
Right.
Are you going to shame him for that?
Right.
You know, he had to deal with something, and you let that happen. So, is he all of a sudden not a person anymore? And so, like, imagine for the people who didn't have a couch to kind of crash on while they were dealing with stuff. I mean, you know, we have to recognize that like we all deal with poverty in different ways, and we perceive it in different ways, and maybe that's cultural and maybe not. But at the end of the day, you know, what do we want our community to be about? Right? About punishing people for having these things come up in their lives, or helping people out and building a community based on the idea that we're here for each other.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, sorry. Just remember, like in the 20s and 30s, when Filipinos started coming here and they're working the farms and kind of service labor in the cities, you know, they were labeled as homeless. You know, when they were, you know, migrating up and down the West Coast, you know, they were labeled homeless. They lived in kind of bunk houses, or like 10 people to a room. And, you know, city officials would call it like homelessness, or they would call them, you know, they're just bums and they're just feeding off the system. So Filipinos were in that place too, you know, even today.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about all these issues and more. We're going to take a quick break, and after that, we will get into our conversation with Andrew from Safe Place for Youth.
You see this dead air right now, right in between the breaks, between the shows?
Just me breathing.
Well, we can actually fill this dead air with an ad.
What?
Yes. If you're a business out there or you want to promote an event or want to sponsor us, you can buy an ad right here in this space.
During this time?
Yes, that time.
Wow.
Cool. What do they need to do?
All they need to do is email us at thisfilipinoamericanlife@gmail.com and just email us what you want to do.
Cool. So buy an ad.
Today.
Buy an ad.
Buy an ad. Buy an ad. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're back.
That's kind of cool.
Hi.
Hello.
That was a great ad, whatever we decided to run as an ad in
Remember,
the middle of that.
You can use this Filipino American Life to put your ads in. So
Yeah.
yeah.
We do ads.
Yes.
Wow.
Please buy an ad or be a Patreon or whatever we told you to do in the commercial.
Right on.
So we have our guest for this episode with us here. Andrew, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hey, what's up, everyone?
up?
My name is Andrew Gutierrez III, and I'm happy to be here.
Cool.
Welcome to TFAL.
Yeah, thank you so much. Dude, this is so crazy. I literally listen. You have like basically gotten me to and from like the Bay Area through road trips like,
Nice.
so many times, me and my friends. So I'm excited to be here.
Cool.
Hey,
And there's-
and that is
I haven't
it
done
right
that in so
there.
long I wasn't prepared.
What? Well, you better pull that out because we expect that right now.
Oh my gosh.
That's a staple.
We haven't been in the studio for a while, so we're still warming up.
Okay.
So, we're here to talk about, homelessness and issues of poverty. And so why don't you talk a little bit about your work and how that intersects with those ideas?
Yeah, I think when I was reflecting on kind of how I got involved in this work, I think it's important for me to kind of start with my family's experience with
Sure.
poverty and just with homelessness and just that population. For folks who don't know, I'm born and raised in Stockton, California.
Stockton.
Hey, South Side. Went to E House with Girly, well, not with Girly,
Yeah.
but
Just a few years
right,
after.
just a few, just a tiny. But we rep it really hard, and so that's kind of where my beginnings start. I'm mixed race. I'm actually third generation Filipino American, and I'm also half Mexican. My ancestors, they were farm laborers, and they organized and kind of attended the fields all throughout the San Joaquin Valley.
Wow.
So that was kind of my upbringing, and that's kind of how my families got together, right? And so just kind of based on that, they were always engaged with Filipino associations, right? So they lived at the Federation. They lived. I went to the Daguhoy Lodge as a young boy, at the Christmas parties. My Lola and Lola were very active, and just thinking back at the reasons why they were active, I think it was this sense of community, right? Just being with their comadres and just kind of always engaging in that community. And so I feel that history and that kind of familiarity of community kind of got me into this work. I was mentioning I went to San Francisco State. That's really where I got to really learn about the significance of my hometown, Stockton. Myself, I actually, when I'm thinking about how I got engaged in this type of work, it actually all started when I was a dancer, right? When we dance, Filipino cultural dancing, when your moms make you dance.
Yeah.
How many of y'all dance here?
Joe.
Right? Okay, dance troupe, right?
I didn't have to.
No, oh, you're one of the lucky ones here. Nah. But it was a way for me to also kind of learn about my culture, right? And so I think that's really where I started engaging in the community, was through dance and through these associations. And then really that's when I got involved with teaching ethnic studies at San Francisco State through PEP, which we
was a
have
part of, yeah, a long time
Hey,
ago.
right? And so I taught with PEP. It's an amazing organization that teaches ethnic studies in San Francisco, and that's really where I started getting involved with working with youth, as well as seeing that homelessness and poverty, it just doesn't look like one thing. right? It just doesn't look like folks who are on the streets or folks who are quote unquote look like they're on substances or whatever the case may be. They're in our schools, they're in our neighborhoods. And so when I was a teacher, that's actually where I first started getting really into learning about this issue, because there was one story, one of my students I remember, and this student, she would always kind of play fun. She was always kind of like the jokester. And one morning I remember she was like, "Mister, like my head hurts. Like I'm not gonna do this assignment." And I'm like, "Man, you always be talking about your head hurts." And everyone started like laughing, everyone's like chilling, like, "Oh, But what I realized was that student actually was living out of her car with her mom at that moment. And because, she wasn't talking about it, because, folks, that's the idea of homelessness, there's a lot of stigma associated with that topic. People are not going to openly say that they're experiencing housing instability.
Wait, what grade was she?
And she was in middle school.
Oh man.
And till this day that sticks with me, because it was like, I had to actually check in with her after I found out the information. I said, "You know what, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry that, I kind of like poke fun at you for like your head hurting. I didn't know that you were experiencing this. What do you need from me?" Right? Like, I don't even care if you're doing your homework. I don't care if you turn in that assignment. Like, what is it right now in this moment that you need? And that was really kind of like the aha moment for me to understand, like, there's so many different people and there's so many different stories and so many different situations that folks kind of get into that will lead them into this situation. And we can't really generalize or stigmatize or even criminalize being unhoused. And it's very, very important that we kind of like think about that. And so, I mean, that kind of like just kind of being involved with my Filipino American community, being an ethnic studies teacher and seeing that it's in schools and it's in classrooms, and then just also working with a lot of queer youth. I was fortunate enough to work with queer youth in San Francisco in the Castro district. And that was really a way for me to also see that, hey, homelessness also affects queer youth, right? Because a lot of our young people, they may be pushed out because of maybe their sexuality or because of maybe their families don't understand what it means to be queer. Or, quite frankly, there's a lot of shame or pride that goes with it as well. So the, youth choose to, right? Because of it's safer. So, those are different things that I think contributed to my experience. And that's really how I got involved with homelessness services.
So you were having this awakening, I guess, and like learning and kind of experiencing through your students and people you were interacting with. But did you ever have a conversation with your family about that too?
Yeah, I mean, till this day, I still have conversations with my family about it. And at first, it was always, around stereotypical kind of questions like, well, why are they choosing to do that, right? Or, that's because they're hooked on drugs, right? That or they're lazy. That's another one, right? Because I work with youth, transitional age youth, 18 to 24, and so a lot of the myths around working with transitional age youth is it's a choice and that they're too lazy to get a job or they're not responsible enough, right? But kind of working with so many of them and hearing their stories, oftentimes, man, they're working several jobs. Right? They're working several part-time jobs because maybe that's all what's available. And because rent is so high here and maybe they're not from this area or maybe because their own family doesn't have space for them, they now need to live in like their cars, right? I mean, I even remember when I was in college, one of my classmates was living out of his car. And he was Filipino American. And this is something that I kind of wondered, like, wait, so why aren't we talking about this? And that's what I think is also something that, should be brought to light is, this idea around homelessness, especially related to the Filipino American community. Oftentimes there's this kind of like stigma around homelessness and also this kind of thing around like shame, right? Nobody wants to be associated with homelessness, or folks don't ever want to find out that maybe their son or daughter is homeless. And so that's kind of like why I really feel like it's important that we have these conversations with our families. So, coming from like having discussions and questions like that from my family all the way, from the beginning of this, when I started this work to even now, they ask me questions such as like, so what is it that they need? Right? Or what is it then that I can do to kind of support them, because my folks ain't rich. They can't be donating thousands of dollars. They can't, so I think that the real question is like, what are different ways and opportunities to engage like our families or our friends, or even just to have conversations so that folks think differently?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because like, and I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but my parents lost their house during the financial crisis. It was one of those subprime mortgage situations. And I mean, even when they were trying to figure out, is there a way we can keep our house? Is there a way we can keep from becoming homeless, basically? Like I kept on trying to mention to them opportunities to get support or help, and they just didn't want to engage on it, right? Like I mentioned at the time, SIPA had a program to maybe help people connect with services, search and involve Filipino Americans here in LA. And they kind of heard it and they kind of didn't hear it because they didn't really want to talk to a stranger in their eyes about the fact that they weren't able to kind of keep their house because of some poor decisions that they made, and they felt like it reflected on them poorly as people, and that just there was a shame kind of around just that idea that they would have to kind of own up and admit they made a mistake,
Right.
When as an immigrant family, and I don't know if this is it's probably not just relevant to just Filipinos, but just this idea that they worked so hard and for it to all just fall apart because of a couple of bad decisions was something they didn't want to have to confront,
And just imagine, like, because I mean, a lot of my family members, they experienced that, right? In Stockton, 2008, that city was,
capital,
exactly. And that's actually how I learned more about that issue, was when I was at SF State, because I was going to SF State at that time in my business classes, because I was a business major, right? Fronting as a business major, but really as ethnic studies, kind of like,
Oh, we've been there.
Right. And learning, like, dude, like, Stockton is like the #1 foreclosed capital in the nation. And like, a lot of my family are experiencing this, but we're not talking about this. Right. And it's this idea around like, it's maybe it's shameful. It's shameful to talk about these things, but imagine if our family would have talked to each other to kind of like give some tips. Right? Like, hey, you're going through this? Me too. I'm experiencing this. How can we pull our resources together to figure something out?
I have a question. Are there different like categories of homelessness and degrees of of homelessness? I'm sure there's chronic homelessness, and there's like people just sleeping in their cars, as opposed to people who are
Literally
in and out of shelters.
Yeah, there's different demographics, and I mean, I think when you talk about, I can speak to like LA's homelessness kind of services and system in particular, and this might be similar to other places, but we tend to kind of look at kind of chronicity for one. Yeah, like, do they have a disabling condition that makes it hard for them to get a job, get education, get housing, and those kind of barriers that like might need more support and treatment. There's folks who maybe have just had like a crisis like recently, maybe just with a little bit of support, we can get them back into housing. It's just a rental subsidy or something like that. And then there's other folks who kind of like that might need a little bit more housing support, but they don't quite have the same kind of barrier as someone who's chronically homeless. We have this thing called the coordinated entry system where people can kind of connect with the right resources at the right time in the right ways. But yeah, I mean, like, but then, and Andrew, you work particularly with, youth. Youth homelessness is a completely different beast from like, elderly homelessness. Even looking at like race demographics. And I mean, there's not enough in the homeless count for us to know like the number of homeless Filipinos, which we'll get into maybe later. But, African Americans, Black people are overrepresented in our homelessness system. There's like 40% of homeless people are Black African American, but only like 12% of the county is Black African American. So there's like issues around kind of like structural racism that like affect people's ability to kind of maintain and stay housed. So
is there data like kind of showing the percentage of the different degrees of homelessness?
Yeah, I mean, there's the data has been collected year over year, and just kind of seeing like, usually it breaks down to like about maybe like a third to like, it's like 25 to 35% are chronically homeless. There's a good chunk in the middle that like needs some kind of support, but maybe not long-term support. And there's maybe another like 20-30% that, it might be like something that might self-resolve, or they might need a little bit of help. You might not even see them in our system. So, I mean, it depends on the circumstances and things like, do you have your own resources you can lean on, like relatives you could stay with? Sometimes we don't find people because they're like doubling up on people's couches, so, but I mean, by and large, I mean, like, everyone kind of runs the gamut in terms of need. So
LASA does a great job. It's a government agency that basically supports homelessness services. And recently, I mean, right now, we were just talking about we're in the homelessness count, right? So we're collecting data to better understand how many folks are actually out there on the street so that we can figure out how to solve this problem, right? And so last year, they recorded that at about one night, there's about 60,000 people on the streets at any given night in LA County.
Wow.
And about almost 4,000 of those folks are youth. And that's actually a 24% increase from last year for the youth age bracket.
What's
so we
the youth
know
age bracket?
The age bracket is 18 to 24 for transitional age youth. And so we know that in that critical time frame of a youth development, it's very, very important that we intervene and help the youth who are experiencing this homelessness. Because if we don't actually intervene at this particular moment in their life, when they're developing, they're getting their credit, they're getting these job skills, they will more likely then go back into homelessness, right? Which causes this chronic homelessness, which then affects like all of us, right?
Yeah. So I had a question about just our geography, right? We're in Southern California. Los Angeles has been called the homeless capital of the states, I believe, right? LA County. Just taking a step back at kind of like the different causes of it, is there any kind of study that says why Los Angeles? Is it the policy that we have that sort of caters to more homelessness on the street? Is it's unaffordable? Is it a combination of all of this? Have we always been the homeless capital based solely on our population?
Because I heard stories that other states send their homeless here.
I've heard that too.
So
I mean,
you can kind of dispel those myths.
Yeah.
I can break down a little bit too, and Andrew, if you want to pitch in. I mean, like, honestly, like something like 75 to 80% of the people who are homeless in LA County have been here for at least like a decade or so. So they're not people who have come from outside in. They're people who have been here kind of all along. And by and large, when somebody is homeless, like they tend to like sleep in the place that's closest to where they used to have a home, for the most part. So I mean, like when someone is homeless in your neighborhood, they probably had an apartment nearby, had a house nearby, and just, you know, that's what they know and where they're familiar with and they're comfortable. So they kind of stay there. What was the other part of your question, Ryan?
I'm curious about like why Los Angeles.
Causes,
yeah,
right?
like the causes of like LA being.
It's unaffordability. I mean, we talk about it on, I think, the gentrification episode and kind of the other conversations we've had, but this is one of the most unaffordable markets in the country. I mean, the Bay Area is the most expensive, but when you compare income to like cost of housing and just living, this is actually worse. Yeah. Because I mean, like incomes in the Bay Area are probably like higher for certain degrees.
Sure.
But yeah, here, like, I think it was something like, I forget, it's like 600,000 or 900,000 people in LA County are paying like 90% of their income to housing.
Right.
Something like that. I mean, like,
which is ridiculous.
Which is way too much, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, the big issue here is like, you know, if you lose your job, right, or like you get like a medical kind of emergency and it's costing you thousands of dollars because cost of living is so high that it's like this one-time crisis might throw you off completely for the rest of your life, and you lose your apartment and it just becomes a downhill kind of experience from there.
Or you get injured, right? And you have to be able to be off of work. So there's so many different stories. And I think that this thing around, you know, the housing prices, the rental costs are getting higher, right? But wages, or majority of us,
hasn't caught up.
It hasn't caught up. Right. So we're now finding that it's just not low income folks experiencing homelessness. It's not just recent immigrants. It's like middle class folks. It's folks with like degrees. It's folks with like, you know, paying jobs that are now being forced to either bunk up with other folks and share. But if they don't have those resources or they don't have those connections, they're in their car. Or if they get a ticket and their car is then towed, then they're now on the street. So it's a culmination of different events that happen that I feel like we were mentioning, some of them are actually preventable, right? If you are lent that $500 to be able to then afford this next month's rent, then maybe you can catch up, right? Or there's other support services that can be included with this, but it's just so vast and there's just not enough resources.
I want to talk about the other kind of like narratives out there that concerns mental health, and that, you know, you kind of alluded to the idea that some homeless folks don't want to be housed, or, you know, they're refusing services, or some of them just don't have the mental capacity to want to change or even laziness. But I imagine that mental health is a big part of this. Outside of the economy, before the economy is the direction of the economy went the way it did, we probably had issues related to mental health. Can you just elaborate a little bit about sort of what maybe some myths about the help that we actually get to provide with some nonprofits out there that actually do some of this work, and how we can connect people?
One thing I do want to just first mention is that like all of us experience mental health.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a part of us being human, and so we have emotions that go up and down. And so I just want to kind of like blatantly say that like we all experience mental health and are dealing with mental health. So when folks are kind of like in a tight situation where they're really stressed out, maybe about, rent or about paying these payments, obviously that affects mental health. But when someone is then evicted or then maybe has to move out of their home and then doesn't know where they're going to stay at night, that messes with your mental health. It affects your mental health, right? And so what we found is the longer that folks are actually unhoused, the more their mental health deteriorates.
It's like a snowball.
It is very much. And then we know when we're dealing with stressful situations, we have coping mechanisms, right? So sometimes those coping mechanisms aren't the most healthiest, right? And so that's why folks maybe will get connected to other substances. But what I really want to paint the picture is like, that we're all kind of in this where we're trying to figure out how we're going to survive. And some of us, have hit a certain situation where they don't have a safety net or any other network. So that's one thing. Another thing is, when someone is, on the street or unstably housed and they do have, some issues with mental health or they want to see a counselor, a lot of times there is stigma even with seeking out mental health services,
right?
Especially within the Filipino American community, right? Talking about anxiety and depression and stress, those are things that, oftentimes we don't talk about. And sometimes, we'll get the whole like pray about it. Right, or pray it away. Well, I need my bills paid, so like how am I gonna? I need to pray on that too. So I think that something that we also want to like address is like there's stigma with seeking out for mental health services and counseling. And so what organizations like the organization I work for, Safe Place for Youth, does is we provide all of the support services on site. So when a young person comes to our center, they not only receive case management, where they're looking for housing or seeing what they're eligible for, what housing subsidies or Section 8 if they're eligible, but they're also getting connected to holistic support services, right? They're getting connected to a mental health counselor. They're getting connected to education and employment, because we know that if folks, don't have a home, it's really hard for them to get a job, because what address are they going to put on their application? Right. And we know that folks discriminate, against homeless folks. So that's something that's very important, is like receiving, getting connected to a job or to education. And even something that just recently that, me working with youth that I've really found important is this idea around creative arts and healing, really focusing on the spirit. Because imagine a young person or just someone in general not really knowing where they're going to get their next meal. Or not really knowing where they're going to live, like by the end of the weekend, that really does something to one's spirit. And so what we provide too on site is we have a healing arts center where folks can be able to creatively write songs, paint, make jewelry, engage in music, whatever it is that they do. Because we also know that like a lot of our young people actually make money off of that. Right, they sell their art. They make jewelry and then they're able to sell it on the boardwalk. So we're actually teaching our youth 2 business skills, right? How to actually be entrepreneurs for that, to be sustainable.
You talked about kind of the stigma of mental health among Filipinos. What about kind of the points of view of homeless people? Like Filipino American point of view of homeless people. Like what are kind of the attitudes of Filipino Americans towards the homeless? Even though some, we'll talk about like actual Filipino homeless people, but kind of the general Filipino American community. Have you experienced any of that?
Yeah, we were talking about this. Mike and I were talking about this earlier. I just want to kind of throw out the question out there. Do y'all see many homeless Filipinos?
I could only like name a handful.
Okay.
I've seen like one or two around Filipino town since we
Okay.
live around there.
Okay.
And I know I saw like there's a documentary by TFC
Oh, yes.
called Box City.
Yes, yes,
And,
yes, yes.
Starts talking about like a group of Filipinos. There's also like in the valley down the street. There's a what's it called? A car park.
Yeah.
Is it park? What do they
Park
call
and
it?
ride?
No,
No.
it's,
The safe parking.
Oh, the safe parking spot.
Safe
Yeah.
parking spot.
Yeah,
yeah.
Parking
and there's
lots.
like
safe
a,
lots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where folks who are kind of car homeless or
Mhm.
who live in their car can park their car overnight and like get services and stuff like that. And I think one of them, like a couple, were Filipino.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, like maybe just stuff I know anecdotally.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
all I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm the same. Like most of the time, I working for the city, I was exposed to seeing a lot of homeless on the streets. Even back then, maybe it's about 8 years ago or so. But very rarely did I ever see Filipino Americans or Filipinos out on the street. I knew of one actually in Atwater Village, and I don't actually know if he's homeless. He's usually just walking around a lot. But never did I imagine it to be like, or never did I see someone and experience someone other than stories. I think that's part of like the, we're a little bit removed from. At least I feel we're a little bit removed from the issue.
No, I know. Yeah, I know. There was one who always used to like panhandle in front of Bahay Kubo
Yeah.
all the time.
My impression is that like Filipino Americans are like they're in that pocket of like hidden homeless. So like you won't know because they're on they're couch surfing or like they're crashing at some other relative's place, and like I mean, Mike can correct me if I'm wrong. But like that is my impression. That's why like it's unseen in the community, and like the perspective of Filipinos. I kind of like it's interesting because like Filipino philanthropy tends to be like tied to church.
Yeah.
And there's like a moral aspect to poverty. It's almost like being poor means you are not like good in the eyes of the Lord or something. And so like but being well enough to maintain, right? Enough to go to church and enough to contribute means that your like your class is essentially tied to your moral.
It's the Puritans, man.
Yeah. And so it just feels like Filipinos have adopted. I mean, it's a generalization, right?
Yeah.
Like Filipinos adopt that kind of application, and so it's like, well, you don't see us, we're not homeless, so we're good. Like we're not like those in us versus them situation. But it's also like you're refusing to look at like, what if you're running a boarding house and you're housing like 10 people in one room? Those people technically are like,
Yeah, they're not quite.
They're not quite housed.
They're definitely at least precariously housed. I mean, if you think about like just how for some of us horror families kind of came from the Philippines, stayed in the extra room or on the couch of like a relative until they were able to get like jobs and things like that.
Right.
But for that support network and kind of like that culture, I mean, for the most part, my parents probably would have been homeless, right? If they didn't have a way to bridge kind of that transition, and then especially in times of economic hardship. Being able to find somebody to like rely on within the family, and I mean, that changes kind of the dynamics and our perception of that. I think.
I think we're just to throw this out there. If we had an advantage towards this, it is that network and that pagkakasama and the idea of like what you said, Mike, like housing someone who just came, like a long lost uncle who's coming. This happened to us. Like we came here. We were not wealthy. There's 8 people living in a duplex, and we had an uncle stay on the couch. So there was 9 people now, But he was doing that because he wanted to save money, and But I think for Filipino Americans and Filipinos, especially immigrants who understand like economic hardship, right? For many immigrants, like I think the network of Filipinos is an advantage to kind of combat that, and like the idea of community and taking care of each other in a like this bayanihan spirit.
But I wonder, even with that, it makes me wonder, like, how does that not translate into the same kind of empathy for like non-Filipinos or other people? Right. Because I mean, on that same token, my parents would see someone that was homeless and like freak out or like avoid them. Or,
exactly.
But I also think what's missing here is the the class of immigrants who are actually coming to the United States from the Philippines, they're not the really mahirap folks. They're not the super poor of the Philippines who are immigrating here.
Right.
Yeah.
Mainly middle, maybe lower working class. They have a certain kind of social capital, economic capital come here. So you don't have, I don't say you're filtering out, but like you're not getting the super poor of the Philippines to come here.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You may have, I'm not saying like everybody across the board, but by and large, Filipinos already come here with a certain type of capital.
Yes.
And that's kind of missing. And if the borders are open and you have all these people from the slums or people from the provinces actually come to the United States, you would see a completely different community.
Yeah.
I think that capital that you're talking about, this like social capital, right? This like community, this network, it's so valuable, right? And I think that not all folks have access or privilege to this type of network. I mean, when you're talking about folks bunking up, like that's my Lola's house right now. Like, like I currently have like 3 or 4 different families living at my Lola's house. Like I live with my Lola. Like this idea of multi-generational living and like shared living is not something new to us, nor is it shameful, right? We prefer it sometimes, right? Because like
it makes a lot of sense.
money. Exactly. But for other folks in American society, right, when we're talking about Western, we're expected to have our own apartment. After 18, you're expected to get up out of the house. Like those are values that are Western and American that can also cause homelessness, right, or lead to homelessness. Imagine how many youth, or my youth anyways, if they could stay with their families or if they had the choice.
Right.
Yeah. I always never got that growing up when people like say, after 18, you're on your own.
Yeah.
I'm like, what the hell?
Yeah, exactly.
That was so foreign.
Oh, that was like a goal for myself.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm getting out of Oxnard.
Yeah. And the only way was like either through college or through some other like resource, right? And so not all of us had that privilege. But I do want to go back to this idea around like, how do we then kind of transfer this value of taking folks in and being able to be a support system for folks who are in our network to people outside of the Filipino American community? How do we kind of extend that network or that support outside of our own families? And so that's why actually the project that I'm working on right now is called the Host Home Program. And so the Host Home Program is basically a grassroots, it's an innovative program that allows community members around LA County to open up their home for about 3 to 6 months for a young person to be hosted, to be stably housed while they're connected to all of our support services, they're receiving case management, they're connecting with their mental health counselors if they choose to, they're getting access to education and employment opportunities, all of these different things that we know that, maybe we have from our own families. That's really what we're providing for this young person. And just like Mike was mentioning, we also try to hook them up into a host home that is in their own community, right? Like folks want to live with other folks who they're comfortable with, who maybe share cultural backgrounds or even like same ideologies. So that's a big part of my job, is actually to have conversations with community members who want to open up their homes, right? Because we love them and we definitely want them to host our young people, but we also want them to be mindful of the situations or these institutional barriers that have caused these folks to experience homelessness.
And I throw it to both of you this question. By the way, that like programs like that, for me is a sign of hope, right? Like a sign of hope, not just for folks who are experiencing homelessness, but for folks who may not know what to do or don't know how to contribute, right? But I also wanted to kind of highlight, in your experience, has the city itself or the county done anything substantial in terms of policy, how are we ever going to afford Los Angeles? Is there something that has been done? Is there money that has been put out there for services? Like, is there a kind of like your 30-second pitch, Mike?
I mean, I will just say as an employee of the United Way of Greater Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Measure H, Proposition Triple H. These were big measures a couple of years ago that took sales tax funds and kind of created resources for building supportive housing in the city and making more supportive services available throughout the county. But what we're learning, I think, is that it's addressing the need as far as we understand it. We had the homeless count this past week. So we're getting a sense of what that point in time kind of estimate of need is, right? But what we learned, what we're coming to realize, and this is through kind of like really understanding kind of the folks who are becoming homeless, is that do we have enough resources to, number one, support people who are at most risk of losing their housing, people who are most precariously housed, and making sure they don't become homeless, because we're going to have this constant inflow because of the cost of housing and job instability and things like that. Like, can we maybe get ahead of the issue and kind of deal with that situation? But also, like, are we providing services and addressing needs kind of in a way that really meets people kind of where they're at? And if somebody kind of only just needs somewhere to stay for 3 to 6 months, you know, we're talking about like maybe youth coming out of foster care that might need to just transition into kind of like, I need to get on my feet, get a job, etc. I don't want to have to try to do that from the street, because like that's that's basically impossible. Like, have you tried to get a job with like, you know, imagine trying to get a job if you didn't have a place to like take a shower and put on your suit, or even had a suit to do to like go to a job interview. You know, you're trying to create the conditions in which, like, you know, these youth might not need like as much as this chronically homeless person who's been on the streets for forever, but they both have needs that we want to address. And so thinking about the diversity of that need, including things like the host home program. I mean, one of the limitations of the resources that we have out there is like we can get more housing resources, but a lot of times it's meant for like a single person or a family to live in, you know. And we were just talking about like this idea of like doubling up, but can you do that in a way that doesn't disadvantage the person, you know, like creates the conditions in which they can kind of continue to improve their situation, you know, that might not meet the needs and the requirements actually of the federal and local funding that we use to house people with. You know, can we be more creative and think outside the box?
There was a study that was recently done that found that one of LA's most underutilized resources are the empty bedrooms. So, you know, what Mike was talking about in regards to Measure H and Prop HHH, those are amazing ballot measures that were passed that now focus on building more housing and more support services. However, those take a while, right? It takes a while to build a building. Right now, Safe Place for Youth is undergoing a redevelopment where we're going to now have our support services on bottom, and we're going to have transitional housing for youth above. Because we know when our doors close at night, where do our youth go? Back out onto the streets, right? Or onto the beach in Venice Beach, because they found a community there that they feel safe. So this idea that there's so many empty bedrooms, or there's so many underutilized bedrooms, this idea of hosting is really kind of something that's new for the county that they're getting into. But we know that this has been done for marginalized communities for generations. We've been. I mean, even to go back into the queer community, right? Where we have this idea, this house mother, right? This queer elder who takes in queer youth because they were pushed out by their families or they can't get a job. This idea of hosting is nothing new. It's just all of a sudden we are now formalizing it and asking other folks to do it, you know? And so that's why I really think that like Filipino Americans and Filipino families in general, like this is something that's not too much of a stretch. And if you can get money from the government to be able to host a youth, then why not? Right? Because a lot of our families, like maybe their kids have gone off now to college or they have their own apartments. But like that extra $500 per month per youth can actually help them pay their mortgage or their rent or whatever the case may be. So now that the government is getting on this type of a program, I really want more families, especially families of color, queer families, to be able to kind of like open up their homes if they can.
Wow. I know my mom did something similar, like a host, but they hosted somebody, a kid from the Philippines who's getting surgery here. Oh, okay. Right? I know my parents will be willing to do something like that, but I don't know, for some reason I just don't imagine them doing something for homeless people here. And I don't know what it is in the psyche. I mean, maybe they paired someone up who was Filipino, right? A Filipino, someone transitional homeless who was Filipino. I mean, it's, maybe, but like even then, there's like this stigma, right? There's still that stigma.
I think it's like the hiya, like it's the shame element to it.
No. I think it's the opposite. It's not opposite, but I think it's more. My parents will probably be like, "Well, you're in America. How come you're not? What's wrong with you? You know, like we did it. How come you can't?"
It's the pickup,
right. So I know a lot of Filipino families who probably think the same way. What would you kind of say to them?
You know, I actually, when I first started implementing this program, I asked my parents. Like I literally, because when I first got the grant and we were granted this pilot funding from United Way, so shout out, thank you so much. That's how,
Good job, Mike.
You know, that's how I got this job here. But when I first got put onto the project, I was like, is this gonna work? Like, you know, our family's actually gonna open up their homes to host someone that they don't even know. And so I checked in with my parents. I like asked them first, like, hey, so like, you know, Ma, like I'm, you know, doing this type of program. Would you open up your home to a youth? And she was like, yeah, like if maybe, you know, if they were like went to church or, you know, like
there's all
like
these
she's already
conditions.
listing, she's already listing all of these different things. I'm like, Ma, this is not trying to convert folks, you know. But she was like, you know, I just want to make sure that, you know, I'm safe, and I want to make sure that they have a goal or they have a, you know, a trajectory, if you will. Right. And I think that that is a valid concern. And so things that like I've done with families is I do what's called like meet and greets, where I have the families actually meet the young people who are a part of the program, so that you can humanize this young person who's experiencing homelessness, right? It's not like end all be all for them. They have goals, they have dreams, they have aspirations. It's just right now they're in this current situation. And so I think once the families meet the young people, they hear their stories, they build that relationship, you know, I think they're more open to open up their home. And that's really what I've been focusing on, is this kind of idea of relationships and community, feeling connected to a network. You know, it's so beautiful. There's a story when I first started this program, a young woman and her husband, they were early 20s, came to me and they had been pushed out of their home because they got married. Right. So their family didn't approve. And we accepted them as a part of the host home program, and they were taken in by a family. And while they were taken in by that family, they were, you know, the husband got a job at LAX. You know, he started working there. The young girl got into a coding academy, so she started working there. And while they were being hosted for 3 to 6 months, their family actually found out that they were being hosted by another family, and the family reached out. You know, and the family was like, wow, like, you know, if another family is gonna take in my own blood, you know, whatever we have between us, whatever conflict, we could work out, you know? And so by the end of the host home program, after 6 months, they actually reconnected with their family.
That's awesome.
You know, they actually reconnected with their family. And you know what? She actually works with me today.
Nice.
She's a youth peer navigator who now works with other youth who are navigating this system, you know? And so that's how I know that this type of program works. You know, they always talk about numbers, especially, you know, in the homelessness services, always talking about data and numbers. You know, those are great, but also those few individual stories that we know that work, that's how we know we need to continue this type of work, right? And so shout out to, you know, Helen and Brian, who the youth that I work with, they're inspiring, they're amazing, and I'm so happy that they've been able to move forward.
Nice. Do you service any Filipinos in your organization?
So there are, but very, very little, right? And this is something that I want to kind of bring up is, you know, while Black and Latino is very overrepresented, oftentimes Asian Americans are underrepresented also because, like, you know, there's so many different races and ethnicities within that own, you know. So we have Southeast Asians that I often see a lot. But, you know, I did have a Filipino youth who I remember was going to our center, and they were actually going to Santa Monica College. And they didn't want to tell their family that they were homeless because of this idea around pride and shame, right? So I remember when I met him and he found out I was Filipino, like there was this like light bulb, or there's this kind of like connection that was made, like, oh shoot, you're Filipino, like I am too. And I just remember like him transitioning, him finishing at Santa Monica College, and him being able to connect it to a housing resource and being able to get his own apartment, you know. And those stories are like, man, like if I wasn't there, like who knows if, you know, he would have felt open to ask for help, right? So I think that that's very important that we even have representation even within the workforce, you know.
Are there a lot of people like in the workforce?
I mean, you know, somehow or another we find each other, you know.
Right, Mike found me randomly.
We found each other. I was like,
there's no association,
right? We gotta start our own, man, our own lodge.
So I think I told this story on a different episode too. Like when I first started working at Loss of the Homeless Services Authority, like, I met Filipinos there, and they were all working in accounting. But they saw me, and they were like, "Oh, you're Filipino, right?" And like they were like glad to see me, and they were also surprised that I wasn't coming to be an accountant.
Right.
I was coming to work kind of more on the kind of like the programmatic side. And I mean, I think we just kind of find each other.
Network.
Yeah. I mean, you kind of just know. I mean, you kind of just ask. I think in any place where you work, you're kind of just like, is that guy Filipino? Is it weird to ask if he's Filipino? And then like, but I mean, if I think about it, and this maybe will lead into a question I was going to ask you too, Andrew, it's just like, I don't know if it's like necessarily like a career path. I mean, I didn't even plan on ending up working in homelessness. I've been there now for the past 10 years. And I think about how I ended up doing this work, and it connects back to kind of the things that we're dealing with like, say, like historic Filipino town, right? Where we're talking about like housing affordability and like the stability of communities, and thinking about like how do we kind of make sure people's needs are met, and also like just being able to be like a brown face in a sea of like maybe like non-brown faces. I think like career paths for anybody can be whatever makes sense for you, but I think like it's something to be said to say like, I am doing this work and I am Filipino, and if I do run into another Filipino, I make sure to like kind of create space and give them space to like kind of recognize that like our cultural values and our cultural identities, whether or not we explicitly bring that into our work or not, I mean, it's there. And it kind of drives the way that we do our work, even if we're not like out like, I'm going to do this the Filipino way, whatever that would even mean. And so, I mean, I always make sure like, actually like even through the program through which we even met, our friend Christabel is one of the people operating kind of like doing that, the program with us, is one of our consultants. And so like, it's just like kind of these, connections that like, oh, I see you, let's make this happen, So.
I definitely agree. Like we definitely like point each other out, and I'm like, when we met, we were like, hey, and he was like, I do this like podcast. I was like, no way, is it TFAL? Like, what's going on here? It was so crazy how we met. But like I do want to say though, like there's a lot of Filipino American organizers, right? Like in on so many different issues, like veteranos, right? Who they also are experiencing homelessness, to like, all of these different kind of like issues or social justice issues. But particularly with homelessness, not so much. And I think it has to stem with this idea of the stereotypical successful jobs, right? Like doctors and nurses or accountants or lawyers. But I mean, when I think about it, those are all service jobs too, right? They're serving folks. And so we're serving a community that's most vulnerable, but somehow that's not given as much, as much weight or as much, encouragement. And I think it does have to connect with this idea of stigma, right? Of what homelessness is and what those causes are. But I think we need to reframe that.
Yeah. I mean, like up until like, my parents felt like they didn't need to help me with rent and stuff. They questioned why I was even doing this stuff, and would especially say things like, they're not going to help you. Why are you helping them? Well, they would say this about like anything I would do. Like when I was working at SEPA, it was like, those kids aren't going to help you, or those veterans aren't going to help you. But like working on homelessness is just like, what do you have to gain from that? You could have been, the computer scientist that you were meant to be. Right. And it's like, and I think like I never let that kind of stop me from doing what I do. But at the same time, it's kind of like, and it comes from kind of just this idea that like, can we take care of ourselves, and are these the kind of careers that will help us like take care of ourselves? And my parents don't question it now. Yeah, no, I don't ask them for like help with rent. But I mean,
my parents ain't questioning it now either. I mean, and it's because there's so much also momentum around homelessness services now. There's so much more funding. There's so many more opportunities, and that's really why I'm so glad that we're having this conversation today, because I feel like right now we're in a time where we can get engaged, we can get involved at different levels, because there's just so much action happening.
Where do you see your career kind of going?
It's funny. When you were speaking, Mike, about like the clear path, when I was thinking about it, like how I got involved with homelessness services, is like I actually started working with youth when I was a transitional age youth. Like I started working with youth, and a lot of them experienced homelessness. A lot of them were actually experiencing things that I was experiencing, like how am I going to pay my bills, especially in San Francisco, right? How am I going? Like I had no credit history or rental history, like all of these things I similarly was kind of like engaged with. with. And so I think I just kind of slowly evolved. And now I see my role as now we're actually bringing this model, this host home model, to different communities around the country, right? Because we know that this host home model can actually be applied to different communities, such as like undocumented folks, pregnant and parenting folks, folks fleeing from DV, right? So we can really apply this type of model to different communities and hopefully even internationally. You know,
caregivers,
right?
I mean, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Because
I mean, think about a host home with like a home full of all of these people getting hosted with like a caretaker or like, you know, someone who's making sure that everyone's getting the support services they need. We know that model, you know? So I think that these type of host homes can actually be applied everywhere. And I'm hoping to be a part of that movement.
Nice.
I'm fortunately enough to go to the Philippines in a couple of months. We're going to have a family reunion.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, dude. So it's
Where?
going to be in Bohol. My family, shout out to Bohol, my family over there, and in Cebu. We're having a big family reunion. But I also want to utilize that time to kind of like check in with folks over there. You know, like what does homelessness look like over there? And especially like for youth, right? Or queer youth, right? And so I just want to make a quick shout out. I actually just got a grant to basically do more programming for queer youth who experience homelessness. You know, it's a big topic, and I think a lot of folks don't really associate the two, right? Oh, if you're queer, then you must not experience this or that. But you know, it's all connected, and so there needs to be more awareness. So I got a grant to basically host like this digital storytelling project where queer youth are going to be able to tell their stories, right? Their true stories, and also as well as their goals that they want. And then we're going to showcase it at an intergenerational drag brunch.
Nice.
Wow.
You know, so we're going to, you know, have a runway. We're going to have folks dress up. And it's a way for us as even people of color to feel comfortable with talking about the queer community, you know, and engage different folks within that community. And so hopefully, you know, I'll send y'all the information when everything goes up. And if y'all can share it, because I think it's very important that we create these spaces, right?
So
Create these
that's going to happen here?
in LA.
Okay.
Yeah. So if folks got a venue, no, you know, or if folks want to help or be a part of the organizing, please, you know, connect with me or, you know, shout out.
You should check out Whimsy in Pasadena as a venue space.
Okay.
It's owned by 2 Filipinas.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
So, wrapping up, is there anything else that's happening, kind of coming up for you? Anything you want to plug or let us know about, or just letting folks know how we can get more directly involved?
Yeah, talking about different ways and opportunities that folks can get involved. One that we kind of already talked about earlier is the homeless count, right? So, you know, folks who maybe have never engaged with the homeless community or even are, you know, aware, this is a great way to get exposed. Another way that folks can get involved is donating time, or you know, we always donate our clothes to like folks back in the Philippines. Like we could donate like our old clothes to youth right here in our backyard. You know what I'm saying? Like you could drop them off actually at our center. And going back to Mike, what he was mentioning, like our youth, they don't like to look homeless. You know, they don't want to be walking around being, you know, discriminated against. So, you know, they work very hard, you know, to keep up how they look and how they're presented in the world. Another way that folks can get involved is voting for legislation, right? So more, you know, support services, more funding to be able to build more affordable housing, because, you know, right now maybe it just might be a specific demographic, but eventually it's going to affect everyone, right? Rental prices are only increasing. You know, folks, we don't have that much space around here, so we're all gonna have to get real comfortable together. I mean, in Hi-Fi, we see it all the time, you know, and in Echo Park, we have the whole community there living there. So I think it's like, you know, how can we maybe donate some resources if we have an empty bedroom that we can open up? And I think the last and most important thing is let's talk about it. let's discuss these with our friends at our family parties, right? And it's not, going back to Elaine's point, like it's not a them versus us thing. It's not their issue. It's actually, we're on community, right? And so going back to that biennial spirit, if one folk in our community is suffering or is in pain, like how are we going to lend our hand to support? So I think that's very important.
Yeah, I forgot to bring it up, but yeah, you're on the edge of historic Filipino town.
Yeah.
You're basically not really neighbors with us.
Yeah.
But you know, I mean, thinking about kind of the things that are happening in Filipino town around like housing and other things like that. Like, I mean, the thing that we've been kind of struggling with or trying to figure out, at least between me and Elaine, maybe the rest of us, is, you know, the intersections of kind of like the things, as you mentioned, like there are Filipinos active on like a lot of different issues.
Yeah,
you know, are they active on things like homelessness, housing, gentrification, et cetera, development? And, you know, I mean, thinking about like how do we get folks involved kind of and find that intersection. And so I think maybe that's something that we can talk about in the future.
Yeah.
As a future
Yes.
collaboration on or off the mic.
Yeah, exactly. Talking about these associations, right? And these lodges, right? Why don't we have one for Filipinos who work in homelessness services? right? Or, you know, or like, there was this article that I just read, a whole bunch of manangs or aunties, they're getting pushed out of their apartment complex in Vallejo. Because as you know, right now, you know, Vallejo, what's happening to all the Bay Area, the rental prices are increasing. And so that building just got bought and they're increasing the rent. So there was a whole bunch of Filipino women who were striking.
Yeah, I heard about that.
And you know, and so it's happening. It's happening here.
There was a similar issue that happened in down in San Diego too.
Yes. Yeah, so, you know, while maybe it's not on the front headlines, like it's happening. And so it's impacting our community for sure.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for
Thank you
sharing your story.
Thank you.
No, I really appreciate it.
And I mean, I think we should have definitely the Filipinos in homeless services, like
right?
I feel like I should shout them out right now too, like at least the ones I can remember is like Angela at CRCD, Melissa at LA Family Housing,
Yes.
Wendy, who some of you know is at LASA, Kristen at Hilton, and there's like a whole Filipino caucus at the United Way. It's Frank, Eric, Brian, Jenny, Cecile, and Andy Mike.
Let's connect.
So we're there.
Yeah.
And so like, you know, let's connect and try to figure out how do we kind of can bring that to.
It's just first names, so like no one really knows.
Well, I feel like I gotta give them a shout out because then, you know.
Shout out to Jomar,
Yeah.
to Marie Chris, to
Exactly.
Jenabel,
Maritas.
Christabel. That's real though. But
Oh man, no, and you know, I think that too. Like going back to I think this starts a larger conversation around how like we can all not be in our silos because all of these issues and all of these things intersect.
Yeah.
Right. So while folks are working on education, or folks are maybe working on, you know, veteranos or immigration or homelessness, like these all interconnect.
Yeah.
So how can we utilize each other and each other's resources?
yeah.
Cool.
All right. You guys have anything else you want to say? Plugs, or-
Thank you.
Thank you for your
Andrew.
work.
Where can
Seriously.
people reach you if they want to help out?
Awesome. So yeah, you can go ahead and email me at andrewg@safeplaceforyouth.org, or you can connect with me via social media at Andrew the Third. It's Andrew TH3 THIRD.
Andrew G.
Andrew G.
Are you related to Andrew E?
No.
Wow.
Do you get that? No.
No.
Joe, I think
Wow,
a lot
that
of
is
people
an
didn't
old
get that.
reference.
Wow, come on, you're dating
And on
me
that
now.
note, Joe revealing his age. Thank you, everybody.
He's my uncle.
This Filipino American Life is produced by Michael Nailot. Our intro and outro music is by Roger Habon, aka 10.4 Raj. Resident reality checker Girly Colado, legal advisor Rianne Fajardo, and graphic design by Vincent Collyer.